Live.
Live. You are live and alive.
Yes. Oh,
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
Greetings from London. Calling Rick in Chicago, not New York.
We're here. I read you 5 by 5. Good buddy. Hey, do you ever feel like we're like Bob and Doug McKenzie? You know,
no, we could
from
work
the
up
Saturday Night Live routine. Like, hey, I'm Bob McKenzie. This is my brother Doug, and welcome to the Great White North. And today our topic is history. Good day. So we are not Bob and Doug. This is History Happy Hour with Chris Anderson and Rick Beyer, and we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook page and YouTube page. And all of our stuff is also archived. Our previous shows are archived on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours YouTube page, so you can certainly check that out there. And we want to welcome everybody who's joined us so far. David and Nancy and Thomas and Ken, and I don't know, can you see some of the others? A lot of names there, Chris. Libby. More names than I can read all at once. And
a guy named Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours.
We have Duncan Hollins from Normandy, and yes, Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours is here, and so we're glad to see you too, Edie. And our topic today is Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, and we're going to get into that. But we're going to do something else first. But before, James Latin is here. I'm very impressed with that. Oh, someone wants to know, did they miss the theme song? No, well, that's what we have to get to before we can deal with our topic. We have to start with I look for new adjectives. What's a good adjective, Chris, for the open? Epic and legendary I've used.
Outstanding.
World famous, outstanding. Okay, and so we ring the bell, and this is the bell, by the way, and the bar is open at History Happy Hour. What you drinking, Chris?
Ardbeg again.
Okay, and for our topic today, which is Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, I have my Glenmorangie in the Aaron Burr shot glass. I used to have an Alexander Hamilton shot glass too, but Aaron Burr broke it. It was a little upsetting.
That's not a preference, is it?
It could be. We can talk about that later. But so if you have anything that you want to ask about Burr and Hamilton, or if you want to tell us what you think is interesting about that story, make a comment, please feel free to do that. But before we get to that, we just wanted to talk a little bit about this show and kind of the future of this show, which when I say that, it sounds like we're raising money, which we're not. Good news. But we've kind of come to realize that we're going to be doing this for a while, and it's going to continue on. And so, Chris, we're kind of looking, and you can talk about this a little bit, we're looking at the future and sort of trying to plan our future shows a little bit more into the distance going forward.
Yeah, well, so a couple things. We're looking at doing a page on the Stephen Ambrose site dedicated just to History Happy Hour to kind of keep everybody up to speed on the news and what we're doing, and past shows, that sort of stuff. Have the schedule and the calendar there so you know what shows are coming up. And we're really hoping to increase participation from the audience. So we'd like to know if there are topics or things you'd like to discuss, because, well, the gerbil can only run so fast for me to come up with new ideas, and we'd like to get your participation. And just without sounding like a commercial, we want you to think of this as kind of your show and your chance to listen and bitch and contribute. So
minimize the bitching, please. Right, exactly. And we'd like to kind of broaden out our topics, and we're starting to do that and look at some things that aren't strictly military history. And again, we're interested in what you guys think, and you can comment or you can email us at hhh@stephenambrosetours.com.
Yeah, and I know one of the ideas that Rick and I have talked about is we're looking at picking a few topics to maybe go into greater depth. So we'll do them over a couple of shows. So that's one thought we had. Also,
Right.
yeah. So please do contribute and let us know what you'd like to see.
Okay, so the reason that we decided, there's a couple of reasons we decided to do Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr today. And one is that I wrote a book on this topic, so it seemed like a great idea to me to talk about them, and that I would have to do less work preparing for the show. And also in that the musical, the Lin Manuel Miranda musical, is going to be premiering on streaming video, the videotaped version of the Broadway show on July 3rd, I think. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that coming up. So I suggested this topic to Chris Anderson, and he dived into a couple of days of intensive reading on it, and then sent me this picture, which I think summed up his point of view, not necessarily on the show, but perhaps on the overall topic of Hamilton and Burr. Chris, how could you? And what is wrong with discussing or what is not interesting about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr?
Well, I think as I told you when we talked about this show,
I don't recall even talking to you about this. It's upsetting to me right now in the moment. And
after those few days of intense reading on the subject, I came to the conclusion that you owe me 2 days of my life back.
Well, so I'm going to have to make the argument for this, I guess, being an interesting topic. And I in all seriousness, I think it is really a kind of fascinating story. And I think a lot of people are fascinated by it. And I think one of the reasons that people are fascinated by it is that if you look at this duel that takes place in July 1804, it is Alexander Hamilton is a former cabinet member. Aaron Burr is the sitting vice president. So it is the equivalent today of if we had Mike Pence facing off in a duel against Hillary Clinton. In the midst of everything else that's going on, you suddenly woke up to read the headlines that the two of them had gotten so irritated at each other that they had squared off someplace in New Jersey and started shooting each other. And I think that just makes you kind of go, wait a minute, what? And so for me, aside from the interesting elements of the two guys, and I think they are both interesting, you have this crazy duel. And it's also, I always found it a great window into the Revolutionary War era and the post-Rev War era, because we have this image of all these people as being in wigs, and then they've got their suits and their cravats and all this stuff, and they look very stuffy. And they are a really fractious, ambitious bunch, and there's street riots, and there's knockdown stuff, and there's duels and all this stuff. So to me, it was a great window on sort of what the fact that they're real people. They're real people, flesh and blood people who get pissed, who curse at each other, and really found a lot of that kind of elements in that story. A great window to that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess one of the problems I have is for me, I have a hard time looking at Hamilton and Burr as founders. So that's right out of the gate, because when I think of founders, I think of Washington and Jefferson and Adams and the people that actually led the revolutionary movement. And both of them are kind of bit players in that. I mean, so I guess when a lot of the stuff that gets written about this story, when they're promoting it, they say these founding fathers that were at each other, hammer and tongs and all this sort of stuff. And they're not founders. They were there, but they had a pretty low rank in the whole structure of things, and they only become to prominence after the war. And you can call them significant characters in the early republic. You can certainly delve into their importance then. And I think one of the things that I don't know, I just think that the fact that they become significant later. I mean, the duel is interesting, but that I think some of the hype takes away from the story too.
Well, okay. I'm sure. I mean, that makes sense. But I think that, and so one interesting question is whether we would remember them or how we would remember them if the night before they had said, never mind, and they hadn't fought a duel. I think Hamilton's still an awfully memorable character. I mean, as writing the.
I don't think he's a founder.
Well, he's writing the Federalist Papers with Monroe. Is he so do you define a founding father has to be somebody who is, and I'm not sure that's an important. It's important that he be a founding father, but that they have to have a role, a high-ranking political or military role in the Revolution.
I think they have to have more of a role in actually pushing the colonies to the point of revolution and then being engaged in the revolution. I'm not saying that Hamilton isn't important, and I'm not saying that Burr isn't important, but they're not important in the context of breaking away from Great Britain.
Well, I mean, I think that this is Burr on the left, by the way, and Hamilton on the right. I think that's true. They're both really young, too, right? I mean, so Hamilton is born in 1755, and I think Burr is a little bit younger than that. So in 1776, they're 21 years old and 20 years old. But they are involved in a whole lot of interesting things. I mean, they both end up being war heroes of a sort. Burr at Quebec, and later in some of the fighting that goes on in New Jersey and elsewhere, and Hamilton at the Battle of Yorktown. Mm-hmm. And they're both involved, very, very involved in the early government as, Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Burr as a U.S. Senator. So I do think that they are not, I think they're more than bit players.
But if they hadn't had a duel, I think that people would remember Hamilton. The general public would remember something of Hamilton. I think Burr would be totally forgotten about, except for people who are just totally geeked up about the Revolution.
Possibly, although the other question on that, which is, I think, a fascinating question, is if they hadn't had a duel, would one of them have possibly become president of the United States? Would they have had later political careers? And this is something that people argue about a lot. Because both of them were kind of washed up at that point. Even though Burr was vice president, Jefferson had already made it clear he wasn't going to pick him to run with him again. But, John Adams said later, that if they hadn't fought the duel, then said, what of our current affairs? We might have had both Burr and Hamilton as leaders of our republic. So, which he did not like. I mean, Adams thought he didn't like either of those guys. Right. There's a great Adams quote about Alexander Hamilton that I use in the book, which I think illustrates, again, the idea that we have to take the founding fathers off the pedestal. He thought that Hamilton was basically a little touched in the head, and the reason he thought so is, he said, because he had and I'm quoting a founding father here, Chris.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
He had a superabundance of excretions that he didn't have whores enough to draw off.
Yes. Oh, you were waiting to use that. I like that. It's good.
That is a wonderful. That is John Adams. And so, you may be right.
All right. So,
but I think that whether you think they're super important figures or not, I also think that the story is a great window on a lot of things.
Well, and that may be, but so as an example of what I'm saying. Look at another one of Washington's aides, Lawrence, right? Scion of one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. One of Washington's aides is equal to Hamilton in terms of experience and background. All these things, they have a lot in common. They're very, very close friends. But Lawrence, by the way, is an abolitionist and does all these things. Lawrence decides to conduct a patrol after Yorktown that he doesn't need to do, and he gets himself foolishly killed. But there aren't musicals about Lawrence. People don't write great tunes about
Nico, this is cheap. Because, the same thing is true of Dr. Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, great figure in the American Revolution in Boston, who people don't really remember because he died.
So my point is are focusing on Hamilton and Burr more because they shot at each other on a field on a cliffside in New Jersey. Who would write books and who would analyze Aaron Burr if he hadn't popped Alexander Hamilton?
You know, everyone. I don't know. No one. I can't answer that question. I'm not. You know, Chris, you ignorant slut. I want. Now, no, but Catherine Byerhurst, my sister here, points out that you need to read more, Chris.
I do.
There's a great little book, Chris, that I do want to recommend. But you know, it's also worth pointing out that Hamilton founded the Bank of New York. Hamilton founded the New York Post. He established made the deal with Jefferson that has the capital being in Washington, D.C. He engaged in the plan that consolidated the debt and thus gave us a strong federal government built on a strong financial set of policies. So I don't think it's fair to say, like, there may be other cabinet members in the early days who are unmemorable sort of non-entities, but I certainly don't think Hamilton falls into that group. Now, it may be more true, I think, about Burr. I don't know that if Burr does not shoot Hamilton, does he become famous? Well, if he continues on and into his later career treason, he might still be remembered more for that.
Wasn't that one of them? Wasn't being Emperor of Mexico one of the options he thought about?
No, he was, I think, trying to be Emperor of Ohio.
Oh, okay.
Kentucky, Ohio, you know, and some of and a little bit of adjacent territory as well. So what else do we have here from you guys should weigh in on this, and we'd like to hear kind of your thoughts and things you want to have questions about. So let me bring up Thomas Benner here, who says Hamilton was an important aide to Washington during the war. And I think that that's true. Hamilton was Washington's aide for about 3.5, 4 years during the war, wrote a lot of Washington's letters to Congress, kind of gives him a stronger voice in dealing with Congress. And Washington leans on Hamilton. And I think, you know, this relationship, although it went through some rocky points at various times, becomes really important to both of them. And, you know, we quote Washington's farewell address as being this sort of famous kind of gift to the nation, and it's almost entirely drafted by Hamilton. I don't say he wrote it, because Washington, I'm sure, edited, changed, and made it the words that he wanted to say. But I do think Hamilton played an important role in that.
Well, he does, but he's my point is that he's a staff officer. He's an aide-de-camp. He's not chief of staff. He's not Green leading troops. He's a very competent, incredibly brilliant staff officer, but he's still just a staff officer. And so, I mean, I think when I was reading Chernow's book, he was making all sorts of claims about Hamilton's place in Washington's family, and therefore his importance to strategy and tactics and Washington's performance, that I thought was just completely overblown, given the role of an aide-de-camp in the 18th century. I think that I think that there's a tendency to want to apply an importance to him because we're building him up as this character now. He's an important figure. He's become an important figure in history, but Washington may have held him in high regards. And I am not denying that he was brilliant, etc. But he was a staff officer, and there were other staff officers who did other things. And I don't know. When I read Chernow and some of the others, I think that they built up his role in that relationships much more than I see in a typical arrangement.
We have Thomas Benner made a comment here, and he said Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis and so couldn't have become president. And I'm not sure that that's true, Thomas. I think that the Constitution made pretty clear that you had to have been a citizen of the United States at the time the Constitution was ratified. And they didn't have a real good national database at that point. but Hamilton had applied for and gotten citizenship in New York. So I think he qualified as a citizen of the United States. I have never heard, in all the stuff that I read about this, I never read about anybody, and Hamilton had tons of enemies. I mean, nobody made enemies like Alexander Hamilton did. I never heard anybody suggest that he would not have been eligible to be president. And of course, I suspect it would have been brought up, right?
Absolutely, by Jefferson.
I'm sure it would have been brought up by Jefferson or John Adams, again, his fellow Federalist, who referred to Hamilton as the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, which is a very uncharitable comment, but true. I'm saying he's Scottish, Chris. Why can't he be in your pantheon of heroes?
Oh, I have said he was brilliant. I said he was, he did a lot, but I just think that we've kind of taken him a little bit farther than I'm comfortable with in the story of the Revolution.
All right, so Jim Lattin has a story. He said, why so much emphasis on Hamilton's military contributions? Jefferson didn't do as much.
That is absolutely true, but Jefferson was involved in the Revolution and creating the country and leading the country through the Revolution. And when all that is going on, when Jefferson and Adams and Washington are having these conversations, Hamilton is a staff officer.
But then
I'm not saying he's not important. I'm saying his importance comes after the founding of the country, and you can't call him a founder.
I see your distinction there. I just disagree with it, and hopefully we can still be friends. But it might be an issue. So, I'm sorry, we're having some technical difficulty, Chris. I think you're not. Oh, you switched to okay. But I think that if you're saying that his contribution before and by the way, he was at the convention, the Constitutional Convention. He was a delegate there, and he was very active. And of course, he's very active in the writing the Federalist Papers, which assist in the convention being adopted.
Yep.
So I would argue that those are substantial contributions as a founder. But I would also argue that anybody who plays an important role in the next 10 to 20 years after that is also, I think fair enough to be called a founder, because the founding of the country isn't established in 1789 when the convention, when is ratified. And suddenly it's all, easy peasy after that. I mean, there's a real question as to whether this country is going to survive. And he's really involved in the efforts to kind of get the country founded on a good footing.
I agree that he contributes things after the war. But what I'm saying is,
I'm just confused that you're over there now. So
at that point,
go ahead.
I just don't see. I just think there's, I don't know. I think we're attributing things to him to a time that it's just not as relevant. I mean, I think that there are other people of Hamilton's level during the war, and I'm not talking about just military, but there are other characters that we don't talk about. The reason Hamilton becomes famous because of what he does after the war, and then he gets shot. That's so I'm not disputing that he does a lot after the war, but I'm saying we don't talk about a whole host of other people. But we talk
maybe we should. Who else should we be talking about?
I said
Gouverneur K. Morris.
Morris. Warren. And I'm sure people from each of these states can come up with their own topics.
We'll come back to other voices here. Matt Brogy. Hi, Matt. Matt says Hamilton's main contribution to the U.S. came as Secretary of the Treasury rather than his role during the Revolution. The Hamilton program, whiskey tax, funding of the war debt, tariffs, etc. And this is what I'm talking about without going into incredible arcane detail about the financial programs that he's advocating. This is kind of the reason that we have a strong federal government, is in no small part to Alexander Hamilton taking that on and pushing that in Washington in that direction. And Jefferson, we have to keep in mind that there's a whole conflict that goes on at this time that's still going on, right? Sort of big government versus small government, strong federal government versus the states, elites versus the common people. And Alexander Hamilton is strongly pushing in a direction for a strong federal government, for consolidating the federal debt so that the other countries will be interested. Basically, if the national U.S. government, the federal government assumes all the debt, then other countries will want to support the U.S. government over the states because they will want their debts paid back, a lot of this being international debt. And so he does really play an important role, I think, in kind of getting us started that would, I think, still be recognized, maybe not a Broadway play, maybe not quite the number of books, that still would be recognized if he hadn't stepped out there on the dueling ground in Weehawken.
Well, I mean,
we might need to get off this argument soon, but you go back to you.
This is more just a question. I mean, and this comes out in Cherno's book and some of the other things that I was reading, that Hamilton's had kind of a mixed reputation in American historiography, right? And there was a great period of time when he wasn't looked upon very kindly. He was viewed as a monarchist and high federalist and whatnot. And Cherno has said that basically it's not until the 30s, the 1930s, when he starts to get reassessed. So you obviously know more about the topic than I do, but so what causes people to begin to reassess that? Because this gets back to your question about kind of these two views of America, and then
I think that Hamilton is a figure who can be adopted by a lot of different people at different times. As you say, at certain times he's been viewed as kind of anti-democratic, a figure of the entrenched elites, the only beloved by bankers and financial people. And I think what changes that is in part the understanding that in advocating for the things he did, he created the possibility of the strong federal government under Roosevelt in the 30s, and that it's sort of a swinging in America makes possible a swing in Hamilton's reputation. And I think that even now, it's possible. I mean, we talk about Hamilton and Burr. Jefferson was Hamilton's really great philosophical opponent.
Yeah.
And I think Hamilton would much rather be linked in opposition to Jefferson than equaled with Burr. I think he thought he was Jefferson's equal. You can nowadays, Hamilton can be, we can like Hamilton because he's in favor of a strong federal government, because he's an abolitionist, because he's kind of creating these systems that allow us to have a strong financial system. He's urban as opposed to kind of rural. So he's been adopted maybe more by the left now, whereas he was more a figure of the right at one time. But Jefferson has shifted too, right? Jefferson was a great figure of the Democratic Party for many years. You had the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners, but Jefferson has gone into disfavor because of his connections with slavery and other things like that. So, I mean, I do think there's a kind of a waxing and a waning of people's reputations over time, no matter who the figure is.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I think that the founders have left enough of a paper trail, no matter when you define founders, that you can read into. I mean, you can pick your founder for your favorite topic in just about any situation. So they're gonna get bounced back and forth. So one of the things that I would like some clarification on, and maybe you can provide it.
I don't know. I'll have to read it. Let me just look it up. Go ahead.
Get into a little bit more about how Hamilton and Adams come apart, and how Hamilton then basically sacrifices the Federalists in 1800, because they're both Federalists to varying degrees, and they both support this idea of a strong central government. And one could argue that their vision is of what the country should be is what it has become, and that's debatable. But so they're kind of ideologically marching along together, and then a very old cantankerous Adams kind of falls out with a younger Hamilton. So, and Hamilton says, "Hey, we're not gonna have this."
Well, I think that these are two huge ego ambitious people.
Right.
Adams has in his short presidency kind of manages to make things a lot worse for the Federalists, and part of this is the passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and so he has, good pun here, alienated a ton of people with these acts, which are basically criminalize all sorts of political protest behavior. And you have congressmen being thrown in jail. And so you have other things like this. And Hamilton just thinks that Adams is destroying the Federalist Party, that if they back him again, the ship is going to sink and never to recover, which, by the way, it largely happened. And so he writes during the election of 1800, he writes a diatribe against Adams. Hamilton is a great writer. He writes huge volumes of material. The Hamilton papers are massive, hundreds of volumes of stuff.
Yeah.
And he writes this diatribe about Adams, which he intends to be, only show to a few people privately to convince them not to. And it just totally explodes. And as so often happens in these situations, it hurts both of them. It hurts Adams and it hurts Hamilton. And Thomas Jefferson is delighted. The Republicans are delighted. They think this sort of helps them win re-election, and it might have. But I think a lot of it is Hamilton just being convinced that Adams is sinking the Federalist Party. And I just, in sort of in line with that, with things that Hamilton writes, one of the really interesting parts of Hamilton's career, there's a day 7 years before the duel, 7 years to the day. So it's July 11th, 1787, and Hamilton is in a super high rage, and he's having a shouting match with another future president of the United States, James Monroe. And they are screaming at each other. And they start, Hamilton says, one of them says, "Get your pistols and I will meet you on the dueling ground." And so it looks like they're going to have a duel. This sort of stuff happened all the time. And that ends up, that argument takes place. And the subject of the argument that they're having is actually America's first great political sex scandal. So as fun as it is to talk about, the founders and debt obligations and the federal government, but a great sex scandal always tops that.
Yeah.
And Hamilton, the reason we know Hamilton had gotten involved with this young woman named Maria Reynolds, and the reason that we know so much about it is he wrote a 95-page treatise about his affair. And the reason he did that is because news of it had been leaked, and he thought Monroe had done it. And basically, he was accused of paying off. So he had an affair with Maria Reynolds, and then he was blackmailed by her husband. Charming people, the Reynolds, those people are great footnote characters in American history. And so he decides that to convince people that he's accused of having paid off her husband, not because of blackmail, but because they're involved in some sort of financial scheme. And so to convince people that he's totally innocent of this financial misdealing, he then writes this long treatise explaining how he had this torrid affair and was being blackmailed over it, to show how innocent he is, right? Now, you've heard the expression, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up.
Yes.
So Hamilton is the disproof of that. Okay, because Hamilton does the opposite of cover up. He does the uncovering, if you will, or whacking things here of his own affair, and that also, and that happens a few years before the election of 1800. That totally kills him, and it totally makes him kind of a laughing stock. And so, because basically he's saying, "Look, I can't be a swindler. I'm just involved in a sex scandal." And it's like, yeah, that's not really the greatest defense in the world. It's not really going to fly. So to me, and I don't, I don't want to reduce myself to gossip columnist. Some of the things that come out in the story that are about the personalities were, to me, the most interesting part of it. And not only Hamilton and Burr, but Washington and Adams and Monroe and Madison. Madison had his nickname. Do you know Madison's nickname when he was in Congress? He was the Speaker of the House, I think. He was called the Big Knife because of his ability to cut deals.
Yeah.
So we have this tendency to think of some of the founding fathers as being above all that, but the great thing about it is that there's sort of great, it's just kind of great humanity running through that story.
Well, but I think in a way, it's also kind of sad, because I think you can see that kind of coalition of great minds that came together to get us through the revolution rapidly start to fall apart.
Yes.
And that, and we deal with the repercussions of those arguments today. So it makes them more human, and that's more interesting, and maybe more of that sort of thing will come out. But I think in a way, it's also a little bit sad.
In a way, though, it also gives me hope, because if things were that screwed up in this golden age, I mean, one of the stories that I also really like, so in 1795, John Jay negotiates this treaty with England, because England is still kind of needling and trying to do bad things because they're the evil empire.
Bad things? What?
Your volume might be going down here, Chris. Hang on. And he negotiates this treaty, which is called the Jay Treaty, right? It's great history. It has great naming of things. And a lot of people are really unhappy about this because they think he has not gotten a good deal. He's done a bad trade deal, bad deal with England. And so those things still get people unhappy. But in this case, there's literally riots in the street. And then there's one day in July of 1795, and there are thousands of people in the streets of New York City, and they are, I mean, we've just gone through rioting and looting. They are beating on each other, throwing rocks at each other. Hamilton gets hit in the head with a rock. He challenges two people to duels within an hour. He's on a tear, and it's kind of this wild, chaotic scene. And there's even, again, there's graffiti. People are scrawling graffiti on buildings. My favorite piece of graffiti, and I want to say they were much more erudite in their graffiti writing in those days, but my favorite piece of graffiti was written on a side of a barn in New York. Damn John Jay. Damn everyone who won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone who won't put up lights in the window and sit up all night damning John Jay.
That's a big can of spray paint, right?
Right. The tagging was just much more, word oriented. They hadn't figured out you could just do a picture of something. And I just, so I think what one of the things that I enjoy in this story is again, looking at this time, and as you say, it's sad, but it's also hopeful, because you just have to remember that out of all this chaos and confusion and upset and anger and ambition and ego comes the government and country that have, stood now for, 240, depending on where you started from, years. I would say coming up on 250 pretty soon. And so that part gives me hope.
So then Hamilton was right.
About what? He was right about a lot of things. About what?
Like the whole federal system and the strong central federal government.
Wow, we're suddenly into current events. So let's just say that it's worked. It's worked up till now, but it needs a lot of tweaking. It needs a lot of tweaking over the years.
Here's a question, and I've had a question I've had, and it's not meant to be a minefield or anything. As you know, I'm kind of interested in the loyalist perspective. And when you read about Hamilton's early life, they talk about, growing up and being exposed to it. And they say that when he first went to Elizabethtown, he's kind of exposed to some revolutionary ideas, but then he goes to Columbia. And that's a Tory school. So when does he become a revolutionary? Because given that, I was surprised that given the amount that he's left as a paper trail, and what other people said about him, et cetera, I didn't come across that one moment where he's like, "Bing, light goes off. Time, I'm now a revolutionary." And I was wondering if you knew some more about what turns him. What's the moment where he says, "Okay, this isn't."
There's a couple of ways to approach that question, and one is that there's kind of the personal and the ideological.
Right.
So from the personal point of view, he's down there in St. Croix. Yep. He's 16, 17 years old, that age, and he is desperate to get out. He Yep. wants to make something of himself. He does not want to be groveling as a clerk, as he writes to a friend of his. And he says, "I wish there could be a war."
Yep.
He writes this in a letter. "I wish there could be a war so that I could prove myself." So part of, you could say cynically, it's ambition partly driving that, but he wants to. He wants an opportunity to prove himself, and he's also been on Nevis. I mean, he has, there's a pretty strong oppression going on, and he's been on the kind of the bottom rung of that in some ways. I mean, not the bottom rung, but as a very poor person, a person without estate, without really even a father that is a legitimate father, his mother dead. I think that he feels kind of abandoned by the establishment, which would be the Tories. So I think he's sort of open to the possibility of revolution. And then he goes to New York, and I don't have the exact year in my head, but I think it's like 1773, 1774, that type of time. And it's a tumult. I mean, there is. We focus on Boston, and you and I both lived for many years in Boston and the Tea Party and everything, but and New York is a more Tory city, but there's all sorts of stuff going on in the streets. And he falls in with Alexander McDougall and other people who are deeply involved in the Sons of Liberty. And he's giving speeches. I mean, he's giving speeches in 1773, 74. So, and he's still, keep in mind, he's not even 20 years old yet. So it's very early on.
But that's my question. I mean, I can certainly see, growing up as he did in the environment that he grew up in, absolutely becoming a patriot, right? But, based again on what I've read in Chernow and a few other books, he's not espousing those views. And I was just curious if there was anything that he wrote later that said, when I was 16, such and such happened, and that
not that I know of, but it really is right about that time. I mean, he's I think 17, 18 years old, and he becomes this fiery Sons of Liberty speaker in New York.
That, was it in that right by the college that I guess gets everybody, kind of really bent around the axle.
So I'm surprised so far that nobody's asked any questions about the duel, but we do have a comment about the duel, and I want to go back and highlight it if I can find it here in our comments area. And it's from Marty, who says that his great uncle David Hossack was the doctor at the duel who pronounced Burr dead. Also, he founded Rutgers University. I think he actually founded the medical school at Rutgers University, if my memory is correct. But he is a very interesting guy. He also is one of the founders of the New York Historical Society. His son becomes a well-known surgeon in the right around the Civil War era and post-Civil War era. And one of the things when you talk about the duel, and if people have anything they want to ask about the duel, you can put it forward there. But one of the things when you talk about the duel is Dr. Husak, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly. He's actually not watching the duel, and in this is an illustration of the duel, which incorrectly shows the doctor as being the fifth person aside from Hamilton and Burr in their 2 seconds. But he's not actually there. He's about 20 feet away, so he's just down the hillside. And in the musical, there's a line about the doctor turns around, to be able to give deniability. Well, he doesn't turn around. He's not there. He's far enough away that he can't see it. And that is precisely why, because you then can't, if dueling is illegal in both New York and in New Jersey in 1804. And so if a case is brought, you can't seek evidence from the doctor because he can't tell you anything. The only people who can tell you anything are the 4 people who are present at the duel. And as I said to you, for people trying to delve into this topic and determine what happened at this famous duel, you have 4 people who are actually present. One of them has a hard time testifying about it because he's shot and badly wounded, and the other 3 come up with basically diametrically opposed stories as to who shot first, with Burr saying and his second both saying Hamilton shot first, and Hamilton's second saying no, Burr shot first. And I always think that this argument really is about who do you blame, right? So who do you blame for Alexander Hamilton's death? Do you blame Aaron Burr because he shot first, or do you blame Hamilton because he fired first and therefore Burr was only firing in self-defense? And I actually find that kind of, I don't hold with that thought. I don't think who fired first really matters. I think if you want to sort of parcel out blame for why they're there shooting at each other or why Hamilton dies, you want to go back and look at their whole careers and really and then there's this amazing 3-week exchange of notes, angry notes back and forth to each other before the duel that also is a window onto that question.
So why do you think it is then that, given that it is illegal, that Burr never really faces the consequences of it, other than, his career is over and he's, but there's no legal consequences. I mean, he kind of dodges the bullet.
Yeah, so to speak, which Hamilton couldn't do. Did you ever speed on the highway?
I did.
Yeah, and you didn't maybe always get arrested for it, right? I mean, dueling's illegal, but it's not necessarily frowned upon. It's not uncommon. It's becoming more frowned upon and more uncommon at that time. But there are, Hamilton's son is killed in a duel 3 years earlier.
On the same spot.
Same spot, same pistols.
Wow.
Same pistols. There are DeWitt Clinton is involved in a duel. The editor of the New York Post killed somebody in a duel. So it goes on. There actually is Burr is indicted in both New York and New Jersey, but the cases don't go anywhere. And I think basically it's because it's really hard, to convict because nobody wants to testify who's involved in a duel. And there is a sense that it's really, nobody else's business, even if it is illegal.
So Kristen was asking about the pistols. Doesn't Mellon bank on them? Or?
They are in, right. It's I think it's a Mellon in New York. They are on display in New York, but they're not. It's not a display that's open to the public. So this is the bank that it's basically it started as Bank of New York. Now it's BNY Mellon. It's Hamilton's bank. The pistols belong to his brother-in-law, John Barker Church, who was married to Angelica, the sister of Hamilton's wife. And so they end up with the bank, and people, I've never seen them. I've always wanted to go and look at them. I've seen the photos of them. They're pointing at each other. And I have a friend who works there, and I've just never had the opportunity to go and take a look at them. So
wasn't that good of a friend then. They could have gotten you in.
They said they would, and I just have never quite been able to find the whole moment in time to be able to go and do that. So
I think some of our guests really have not been able to enjoy their cocktails. So I wanted to ask you, how are you going to tie the Ghost Army into a discussion of Hamilton and Burr?
I'm going to wait till my history joke.
All right. Okay.
All right. So I'm gonna pull this out at the last minute for those who want to drink when that subject is mentioned. I'm not going to mention it now, but I will pull this out at the last minute. Fear not. Margie Demko is asking if other people are having trouble with the audio. I'm not. I can hear Chris, and Chris can hear me, and so I don't. If other people are having trouble hearing, do let us know, and that'll be useful information. And I think we can answer this one question here before we end with our important things that we're going to do at the end of the show, which is our history joke of the week and history happened here. But what was the duel about? I don't know any of the details. The duel was about basically what caused the duel is different from what the duel is about. What the duel is about is many years of sniping between them that finally they get so angry about. In particular, Burr gets so angry about that he just can't stand it anymore. But the cause of the duel is kind of interesting because the proximate cause of this duel is just ridiculous. There's a doctor in upstate New York who goes to a dinner party in early 1804, and Hamilton is there, and it's during the governor's race, and Hamilton says some terrible things about Burr, which the doctor reports in the letter. But that's not what causes the duel. What causes the duel is that Hamilton, the doctor then goes on to say in this letter that he writes that Hamilton expressed a still more despicable opinion about Aaron Burr, which I could detail to you. This is actually a letter to Hamilton's father-in-law. And though that phrase, a still more despicable opinion, is when this letter is published by accident or by design, is what sticks in Aaron Burr's craw. What is the still more despicable opinion? And are you insulting my character? And this is my honor. This is a very important thing for these guys, especially guys who've been in the military, but for all public figures to stand up for their honor. Because if I allow you to, you can insult me, you can tell me I'm wrong, you can be on the other side, you can do all sorts of things, but you can't call me a rascal, you can't insult my honor. I must stand up for it, otherwise no one will respect me. And so when Burr reads this letter in a newspaper, he writes Hamilton a note sent through a second. And he says, the second is assistant for a duel. And he says, essentially, what is this more despicable opinion that you've expressed? And are you casting aspersions on my honor? And at that point, there's an opportunity here for Alexander Hamilton to go, oh, sorry, I didn't really mean anything by that. And I don't know what he's talking about. But instead, what Hamilton does when he writes back to Burr is he kind of taunts him. And he says, well, who really knows what the difference between despicable and more despicable is? And I can't really say what someone might thought was a despicable thing I said versus the more despicable thing. And he just kind of, I think it's in your face, Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr's not happy about it. And from there, it's they keep exchanging more and more notes over the next couple of weeks, and it degenerates into the duel. But the thing that I have found really fascinating, and it's how I opened. Did I mention I wrote a book about this? It's called Rivals Unto Death.
Okay, yeah, good. I'm glad you did.
Just wanted to mention that. Rivals Unto Death. The thing that I found really interesting is that 1 week before the duel, and this is the opening of the book, they're sitting side by side at a dinner. And it's at France's Tavern. You can visit the room where it took place. And it's the July 4th dinner for the Society of the Cincinnati and all these officers who served in the Revolution. And they are the guests of honor. And it's the vice president. And it's the former Secretary of the Treasury. And nobody knows. They know that they're going to be meeting soon on the dueling ground. And nobody else knows. And to think that you could sit next to someone and sort of carry on normally and yet be so filled with rage that you have to shoot it out with them. I mean, you're right. That is what makes the story interesting. And that, sir, the interest in that then infuses their entire 30-year relationship with interest.
Yep.
And that's the final word on Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, I think. But okay, Chris, so we also said that we would go back to doing this week. A history happened here. Yep. And I think you have a history happened here from London. So do you want to talk about that? I can cue the photos up for you as you need them.
As we're all going through lockdown, for us here in London, we can get out, we can walk around the neighborhood. We can't really go very far, so my family and I, on Saturdays, we go out for long walks and just try to find things. And I hope to show you these next series of photographs. We did our discussion with Q about the Battle of Britain, but I have a connection to that right around the corner from me in my neighborhood. So if we would show so that is the Maida Vale tube stop, and that is 30 seconds from my front door. It's interesting in that it is the first London Underground station that was staffed entirely by women. Result, yep. That started during the First World War. And it is referenced in some Hitchcock, referenced in a Hitchcock film, and it appears now and again. It's a kind of a classic early 20th century British tube stop. But what is so interesting is immediately across the street from that, where that house sits right there on the evening of October 10th, 1940, at the height of the Blitz of London, a 1,000-pound bomb fell right there. And that's some damage from the neighborhood. October 10th was a bad evening for kind of West London, and a lot of the bombs fell. And I found out about the bombing that evening from a wonderful website. We'll try to post the link on the site that lists where every single bomb fell in London during the Blitz.
I've seen that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful graphic display of the Blitz. And I just thought it was really interesting that it happens right outside my front door. So that was
mine is from about an equal distance away from our apartment in Chicago. There's been a lot of news lately about statues, things happening to statues, and we won't go there. But there is a statue not far from my apartment of a Civil War general, a Union general named John Logan, who incidentally used to, when I was little, we thought we were related to him because he's a Logan, and my mother's mother, my grandmother, was a Logan. But it turns out if it's a connection, it's a very distant connection. But it sits on a little hillock there, and you can see some Chicago buildings in the background, and it's right off Michigan Avenue. I'm standing on the sidewalk on Michigan Avenue when I take this photo. And here's another photo of the same statue from August 1968. And it is covered with protesters at the Democratic National Convention, because across the street is the Conrad Hilton Hotel, which is where the was the headquarters for the convention, and the street in between them is Michigan Avenue. And if those of you who know your 1968 history would know about the Battle of Michigan Avenue between the police and the protesters. And I thought of this, because of obviously recently there's been a lot of protests here and in a lot of places. And again, it's always a reminder to me that in America, whatever's happening now, it's always important to look at the context. It's probably happened before. And protests and street protests of various kinds have been going back since mobs in Boston were tarring and feathering those poor loyalist people and rummaging through their houses and everything. And I thought it was interesting, too, that you have a statue which commemorates a figure from one era, and you have sort of history happening on that spot in another era.
And I would use this as a segue to ask folks if there's similar places near where you live or things you see as you're driving or walking or riding your bike around. Send them in. We'd love to kind of see where history happened for other folks too.
Absolutely. And so now we're gonna end with the history joke. I have two history jokes. Okay, are you ready?
I am.
Are you suitably geared up and prepared for this foray? No one I know thinks that I'm a joke teller. But Chris,
I think you're a joke, but
oh no. Oh, so why were the Dark Ages so dark?
I don't know, Rick. Why were the Dark Ages so dark?
Because there were a lot of nights.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready for? It can get even worse. You ready?
Please dig that hole deeper.
A Ghost Army veteran was with his grandchildren, and one of them asked, "What did you do in World War II?" And so, what did he answer?
I don't know. What did he answer?
I blew up tanks and guns.
I get very good.
So, thank you.
That wasn't enough to finish our drinks, but okay.
Okay, I'm So thank you everybody for joining us. And next week we won't subject you to just Chris and I again. We'll be having a guest, and we'll be talking about Lawrence of Arabia, as well as the entire British military mission to the Hejaz, and with the author James Stejskal, who's author of the book Masters of Mayhem. And so if we'll post some stuff on the reading list by Monday about that if you're interested in checking it out. And as always, you can check out all of our previous shows and the various interviews we've done, and they're all on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours YouTube page. That's the name of the company, right? Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours YouTube page. Chris, another pleasant hour. Thank you so much. And I forgive you for all of that stuff you said about Hamilton and Burr, although don't talk to me for a couple of days because it might be challenging. Okay. Farewell.